think there are a lot of different aspects to Cascadia. There's the culture, there's the ecology and the bioregion, and there's also the economy. We live in a place that stretches from southeast Alaska down to northern California up to the Continental Divide, and it's an amazing region, very diverse. 60 million people live here, and the size of the economy is something that would be equivalent to Indonesia, Mexico, something like that, if it was an independent country. So it's an amazing, diverse region. I'd like to talk about the different aspects of it: the culture, the ecology and bioregionalism, and the economy. So.
Oh, sorry, I was just doing a mic test. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
Yeah. Ian, the rudest host ever. So thanks for coming, everyone. I don't know if any of you know me, but I'm Ian Martinez, the least qualified to talk about Cascadia on this entire panel. But I have a weekly podcast called UpZones, which I hope you will subscribe to. Today's live episode we'll edit it a little bit and run it this coming week. So check it out, UpZones Podcast, on all the things that you get podcasts on. Should we do a little intros? Is that a good way to do it? So I actually asked the group to tell me what to say about intros, because that's an area where you can get into landmines. So let's just read what they said about themselves. Andrew Engelson is the executive editor and founder of Cascadia Magazine, as he mentioned. It's a nonprofit publication dedicated to journalism, essays, fiction, and poetry across the Cascadia bioregion. Paige Malott is... Malott. Damn it!
Happens all the time.
The thing about it, podcasts, is you can edit them.
It sounds like Sir Mix-a-Lot, if you remember that.
I feel a poem coming
Paige Mix-a-Lot is chair of Cascadia Rail and has been an advocate for public transportation projects for over 10 years. Tarika Powell is a Cascadian transplant and environmental policy researcher for Sightline Institute, whose work focuses on fossil fuels and petrochemicals. And Nadine Maestas is a poet's poet, who thinks that the sentence is an extremely oppressive totalitarian regime. With that in mind, Andy, I think it would be great to start with you, just as the kind of, the one whose Cascadia thoughts are in our inbox every day. What is Cascadia?
It's a great question. A lot of people define it differently. I mean, some people talk about it, we have different words for the place we live in, Pacific Northwest, which doesn't really work sometimes for people in Canada, because, it's that's actually their Southwest. I think Cascadia is it's this region of 16 million people reaching from southeast Alaska down to northern California, and then extending pretty much to the Continental Divide. And it's both a region, but it's also those people within the region, 16 million people. I think there's a unique culture to it, and maybe we'll get to talk a little bit about that.
Well, Nadine, what is Cascadia culture, in your opinion?
Cascadia culture is under huge transition right now, in my opinion, because it's becoming more diverse. And that is, it's changing so much right now in a way that it's probably never changed. For a long time it was very indigenous, and then a bunch of colonial people came in and were like, we're gonna do this up and chase you guys out and stick you on certain lands, we're gonna take the rest of the land. And then after that happened, then there was some really racist policies put in place, which we'll probably talk about as we go on, that kept it very white, specifically very white, and then kind of American whiteness, not this general whiteness. But now, as much as we kind of harp on gentrification in Cascadia right now, and especially in Seattle and Portland and Vancouver and the cities of the I-5 corridor, it's also bringing in more diversity than we've ever had, which is a kind of a weird tension to talk about in the city. And then also it's just there's a huge boom in the arts. So if Cascadia's really starting to define itself, it's right now, in my opinion, and it's partly because of the boom in the arts, and it's fortunately and unfortunately related to gentrification and all the money coming in and artists moving here.
That's right. It's funny, the last live episode we did, we talked about the arts.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of artists and art coordinators, and this connection between money and art
Yeah.
and culture, and how, like, you know, if you look at the canon, which I know is very like West End and Male and all that, but it's kind of what we're taught, right?
Yeah.
It's always, the center of arts is always where the richest person in the world is. Right?
Yeah.
Or for a very period of time, like Venice
Yeah.
and New York. Well, guess where the richest person,
Right.
two people,
Yep.
to my
Yes.
understanding, in the world
Exactly.
live.
Yeah.
So we have the opportunity to seize that and take
Yes.
those resources and put them into the arts. I mean, do you see that happening?
Yes, I absolutely do, and in a way, it's attached to the richest people, but like, or the two of the richest people in the world being here. There's so much money here, but for a long time, there's been so much money here, and it hasn't expanded. It hasn't hit the arts. It hasn't like fruited a boom for a long time. It's been here. It's been the case. There's been immense growth, but there's something really different that's happening right now that. For the arts, it's happening. So there's waves of gentrification that happen, I think, that you can see on a very social level that people don't necessarily talk about. So usually what happens is there's a queer movement that moves into a space, and it's specifically lesbian and trans. And then there's a lot of DIY kind of projects in neighborhoods and community service that happens from these communities that build up neighborhoods, start to fortify them, make them stronger economically, artistically, politically, socially, and then artists start moving in. And then artists start like a new kind of beautification or gentrification wave of the project, and then gay men move in, and really start to bring in an influx of money. And then after gay men move in, there's an influx of single families with money, with income. And I feel like that's kind of where Seattle is at right now in its huge neighborhoods. And there's a tension happening back and forth of who's coming into the city, because there's a lot of single people coming in the city, there's a lot of queer people, there's a lot of people of color that haven't been here before. Just a lot of different communities coming into a place like Seattle, and not just Seattle, but a lot of the hotspots on the I-5 corridor in particular, and bringing in money, bringing in difference, bringing in different aesthetics and artistic things that are going on, that are booming, that are really directly related to this. So after the single families, well, then, you know, we start moving more to like a San Francisco-like model. But right now, I think where we're at is this sort of single family boom, and that's really good for the arts, because it means that the arts have already been like booming, and when the arts boom, that's how we define culture. That's how we like sort of connect. We connect on a lot of different things, but usually around culture and the arts, that's pretty significant for a place to define itself as a place. There are a lot of things that go into that, but in terms of we're Cascadia, like we're still figuring that out, right? And part of it is because we have a lot of dynamic transition right now.
That's great. That's really insightful. Thank you for sharing this. Paige, that actually raises a question for me, which is, I mean, a lot of what we just heard is about how wealth and just people are moving into these concentrated spaces up and down the I-5 corridor, right? And I know that a lot of what your work does, and I encourage you to talk about it,
Sure.
really focuses on, A, reducing the friction of that movement, right? There's a social component to that, but also spreading that out, spreading access to whether it's jobs or wealth or, you know, arts or whatever it is. And there's a voice, someone in Tri-Cities has a voice that maybe someone in Seattle wants to hear. That's the artistic component. Someone might want a job in Seattle. So how do you see kind of the project that you're doing in terms of, you know, high-speed rail, of creating that opportunity in Cascadia?
Sure. So Cascadia Rail is a nonprofit advocacy organization that supports high-speed rail connections between Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver, British Columbia. And we're looking at our connections between Seattle and Vancouver, and our connections between Seattle and Portland. Also with the opportunity to have stops in between those cities. So looking at Tacoma and Everett, and how we can reduce commutes from 90 minutes of driving, say, down to 15 minutes by train, which would be awesome. Or being able to tap into Bellingham and make that a commuter city, or have people commute from Portland into Seattle to work. So we're looking at, you know, how could this really change the way where people can live where they want and have access to more affordable spaces to live, but also have access to competitive jobs and more job options. We're also exploring what would it look like if we ran a high-speed rail line out to Spokane, and how could that, help people have different opportunities there and reduce those speeds of your 4 or 5 hour journey. Maybe even cut that in half or make it faster than driving. So what we're looking at too is with access to different things like arts activities and things like that, we would be able to say if you have someone living in British Columbia and they want to come down for a show, or if they want to come down for an exhibit, it makes that an evening trip for them versus, oh, we have to plan to come down and spend money on a hotel, and really make it more of an investment to come down for those things rather than looking at it as
increases
a region.
accessibility.
Correct. Yeah, it makes things more accessible, and those activities in the community is more affordable for folks.
Tarika, that has a strong environmental impact, right? Right now, what would you say in this region is the number one kind of, I'll call it, what are we missing? What are we not protecting here that maybe folks would want to know about, that we should be putting our attention on preserving as part of the Cascadia environment and surroundings?
That's a good question, and my answer might be self-interested, but I think also accurate. Since my work is in fossil fuels, I think that's the biggest threat that we're looking at right now in Cascadia. In Cascadia, we have a lot of intentionally protected spaces, and that's not to say that we don't have a lot of the same environmental issues, but I think there is a lot more awareness here and a lot more intentionality about protecting the natural environment. But where people are unaware of some things that are going on is that over the last decade or so, the Pacific Northwest has been under tremendous threat of basically becoming what I like to call getting a Gulf Coast makeover. There's been so many large fossil fuel terminals proposed here. The world's largest coal terminal, the world's largest methanol terminal. Methanol is derived from fossil fuels. It becomes a precursor to making plastics. And we're under that threat just because of geographical location. We don't have a lot of fossil fuel resources here, so they would be shipped from the mountain states or NBC from the interior of Canada by rail and by pipeline, introducing all sorts of physical hazards, oil trains or pipeline hazards going all the time through numerous the lands of numerous First Nations and indigenous peoples, and also the takings of private land by the federal government. Those issues being connected to these large fossil fuel terminals that are essentially moving resources from the interior to be refined here, loaded onto ships, and exported to Asia. And so we're taking on the threat is to take on all of the pollution and not very much of the benefits. And what you see not only is that we have been very successful in fighting these terminals off, but if they had been successful, you would have seen a tremendously different pollution impact that the Northwest would have had, and which would have had a global impact. And I think we're still we've been very successful, but we're still dealing with the threat. And the threat right now is in building large-scale fracked gas terminals. This is natural gas, which now mostly comes from fracking. And people have a false perception about the cleanliness of natural gas. And so the fight that we're engaged in now is educating people that you've been miseducated that this is a clean fuel, and that 70% of it today comes from fracking. And a lot of it is natural gas is going into making petrochemicals, which makes plastics, and so that whole supply chain is rather unfortunate. And so that is, I think, the biggest threat we're facing now on the Northwest, at least in BC. They have the biggest problem going on right now. About 2 years ago, there was almost 24 liquefied natural gas export terminals proposed there. And just because of the market, a lot of them have now fallen off. But we're still looking at 12 to 15, and the market is not all. It's a fickle ally, and so we're talking about tremendously large terminals of unprecedented size and scale that could really have a quite large detrimental impact and change what our contribution is to climate change in the Pacific Northwest. And so I think that's the biggest threat.
Yeah, and at the end of every episode, for those who listen, we do a If you care about, you should. So maybe you can give some.
Yeah, if you care about.
We'll do it at the end.
Spoilers.
Avengers and UpZones.
No
We don't want no
spoilers.
spoilers.
No spoilers.
So Andrew, you've been on the show, and we talk. I try to get to know the people, and it's a little harder in a panel. But what is the spiritual animus here, or the spiritual animating force of Cascadia? What does it mean to you that now you've heard kind of a little bit from everyone? What is it to you?
Yeah, I think it's that unique combination of awareness of the natural environment here, and then this kind of creative culture here, I think. And that's one of the reasons I formed this magazine, is because I'm really interested in both the natural environment here, the bioregion, and what's going on, and what, how we're impacting it, and how, are we succeeding in actually, working on climate change, working to protect orcas, these issues that cross the borders, that don't, when wildfires burn, the smoke goes across the border. It doesn't pay attention to that 49th parallel. When salmon are accidentally released from, a pen, that are Atlantic salmon, they don't follow, they go all over the Sea. And so I think that's one of the animating things for the region, is this real appreciation of the natural beauty of the place. And I grew up here. I wasn't a hiker to begin with. I sort of was a reluctant hiker as a teen, but in college I really got into it. And so I think that's the one thing. And then I think also just the real creative spirit here. I think there is kind of a DIY creative culture here that's different from New York or LA, or in other cases Toronto, when Vancouver is looking. And so yeah, that's for me what animates it, I think, is that the intersection of those two things.
Yeah, and my take would be, I think a lot of folks would have a similar answer. They might add something about the politics. But I think the politics would be the thing that everyone would say something a little different about.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia all have basically center-left governments now, which is obviously in contrast to lots of other places in North America. But at the same time, we have places where we're not moving forward. Jay Inslee's running on, climate change, and he has, a good record. But, there are ways that, Washington or Seattle is behind on a lot of environmental efforts, and we didn't pass a carbon tax. This legislative session was great. And then British Columbia maybe is moving forward a little bit better on housing policy, in Vancouver, but their mining policy and their timber policy is atrocious. So that it's this mix. We're sort of liberal, but then you've got the stuff on the other side of the mountains, and it's an interesting mix.
Plus we have Idaho and Montana.
Yeah.
And that's significant because those are vastly different places, and yet we still. So I think on the culture side of things, one of the things we're interested in is like, how do we all fit into the same place, and how do we all relate to it? Because it's not like people in Idaho who are significantly more conservative than people in a city like Seattle or Portland or Vancouver. It's not like they don't care about the environment. It's like the same kind of investment, but the language that we use to talk about it is so different. But we want very similar things, which is, to me, kind of very fascinating to think about, And we don't really talk about what's off the I-5 corridor. We just literally neglected that Montana and Idaho. Most of Idaho is part of this bioregion, and the Okanagan Valley, which is more conservative than the west side of Canada. Than when you get on the other side of the mountains. And yet we share watersheds, that we share fish, we share oxygen, we share smoke that sits over these places now. And that's real,
Don't we also share, at least at the macro level, a cultural aesthetic too? We're different cities, but there is a Cascadian culture.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you said the word language. You said the language we use to talk about it, meaning maybe a left language and a right language.
Yeah.
You're a poet.
Yes.
What help us understand what is going on? Why is there this dialogue that isn't really a dialogue? It's really two sides shouting around a similar culture
thing,
and the same bioregion.
I think we use really different things in there. They're in terms of like a sort of more conservative aesthetic or politics in the bioregion versus a liberal one. we do talk about similar things. The language we say is just really different. So one thing that, if you're looking at conservatives or Republicans or however you want to categorize this other side that's not necessarily in the cities, is they really like this concept of freedom. You know, so to use terms like energy freedom instead of climate change is significant to opening the door to talking about it. Like, do you want energy freedom? Yes, I fucking want energy freedom. Yeah, that sounds great.
Right.
But no, that climate change is bullshit.
Right.
You know, it's like we're conditioned to respond to certain words and terminologies. And I think that, I don't know that we're going to find a common terminology, but one thing that's really useful as somebody who both teaches expository writing, argumentative writing, and is on the culture side of like making culture, poetry, creative writing side, is that we forget about counter arguments and what that means. The power of being able to utilize the language and the words that the person or the group that you want to persuade is actually using. We've forgotten about that. And yet we saw it be so fucking effective in the 2016 elections. So absolutely effective. And yet we forget how powerful counter-argument is, and knowing like what are your terms? Like, how can I talk to you on your terms, not just like I'm panicking about these things. These are my terms, but like you think about it differently. We care about the fish. You like fishing, I like fishing. You like drinking good beer, I like drinking good beer. But for some reason when we argue about politics, we're just butting heads and we're not talking about these things that we actually love and care about.
I think one thing that's really interesting is just following in Idaho, there was just recently, they passed on a ballot measure, basically Medicaid expansion. And this is a very conservative state. And how did they, they phrased it as Medicaid expansion. It's basically expansion of Obamacare.
Yeah.
And they're not talking about it as Obamacare, they're talking about, and then of course the Republican, legislature went to try and backpedal and they weren't successful. There was a big backlash. And so it's really interesting. And I think places like Idaho are changing. Spokane, we did a piece on Spokane, and Spokane is fascinating right now because people are fleeing Seattle. Like I think I saw a stat that 2,000 people are leaving King County for Spokane County every year. Because it's not affordable anymore, and so that's changing the dynamic. It's getting more progressive and liberal as newer people are moving in. So that the east side is changing.
Whole new wave of gentrification.
Yeah.
Paige, I want to stick on this language thing. Actually, I want to talk about that. How do we use? Again, let's take as a given that there is merit in connecting us with a more energy efficient, faster route. I think one of the things I talked about with Jonathan, your I don't know if he's your co-founder, but your peer is, look, if you're gentrified, if you're pushed out of a city, and if you are part of kind of the ring of still trying to chase your economic opportunity, but you're kind of out, and this would be helpful. So we'll take it as a given that transit, and especially long transit, is very helpful for a region. How do we use the language of, I don't think we need to go to Montana for high-speed rail in Washington, but how do we use the language of Spokane? How do we use the language of, I'll just say Tri-Cities again, to sell this and kind of convince Washingtonians, because we're the first domino, right? We've got to get Washington, then we'll get everyone else. What is there to say, and what's the argument that we can make that is on everyone's terms?
Well, one of the things that's important to us is going out into the communities and learning what's important to the individuals in these different neighborhoods. So what's important to people in Bellingham is going to be different to what's important to Seattle or Tacoma or Portland. Same thing is going to be when we look at Spokane. If we look at the Tri-Cities areas, those narratives are going to be different. And it's being mindful of that and looking at how high-speed rail as a solution is going to help those people's first forethoughts and concerns, but also about their concerns about how it might change the way that they're living. So, for example, we'll use Bellingham again as an example, and there's concern that people might move in and it would change the landscape of their neighborhoods, costs would increase, etc., and really kind of turn it into another Seattle, like Seattle beat. and there's always a risk that might happen, but it's also what are some of the benefits of this coming here, and what are things that we can do to plan so that your community culture stays intact.
Yeah, and then staying on that, I'm curious, Tarika, why you think we lost the carbon tax. And again, I think about it personally in terms of something about the culture that wasn't ready to do that, right? The collective Washington. What was it in your very expert opinion?
I actually am a little bit nervous to answer that question because it was. I think there was a number of factors. I think that. Well, for one thing, there was so much money spent in opposition to the carbon tax, being grossly outspent by people really using language in a manipulative way, as you were saying, and you know, using opposition and marketing research on what people respond to negatively, and being able to use that to frame, you know, what was going to be happening with the carbon tax to misrepresent it. And so I think you can't really undersell the value of being able to afford to get that misleading language into everybody's homes.
Yeah.
You know, but you know, the topic of language is one that's really interesting to me as a transplant from the South, from a culture that's really a lot more direct than here. When I've lived here 4 years now, but my first year here, I had a moment where it dawned on me that the reason I was having such a hard time conveying myself to others and really clearly understanding what they were saying was that we're all speaking English, but I'm using the English language in a completely different manner in which than they're using the English language. And it took me quite some time to adjust the ways in which I use the language to be understood and saying things without saying extremely clearly. And so I think that is another thing that kind of defines the Cascadian region. There's a very different usage of the English language here compared to other places I've lived in the country.
Well, like in New York, growing up, we used to say always, and that just meant sometimes. She's always late. Like, not really. But yeah, so I know exactly what you mean. But what do you think is an example of that? How do people react differently to language here than where you came from?
Well, I think that what's interesting is that back home, I'm from Arkansas originally, and I have family in North Carolina, so I spent my years between North Carolina and Arkansas. I've lived in Louisiana, I've lived in Georgia. And according to my family, I'm a little bit too passive. I don't speak up enough for myself. And of course, when I moved here, I was way too direct. And the feedback I'm getting is, oh my God, can you calm down and bring it down a notch and not be so forward and demanding? And I'm like, what? It's just this totally different dramatic change in the way that people interpreted the way that I spoke. And so I think one of the major differences here is that people are fairly passive, and so I had to intuit what they meant from what they were saying, because they were not saying what they meant. And so part of being successful here was learning how to decipher what people are actually saying. And they might think they're speaking very plainly, but to me, they were not speaking plainly at all.
Can you help me decipher? Follow me around my job?
Is there a workshop?
How to speak Cascadia. Well, that's great. So unfortunately, we don't have anyone from British Columbia here today. But what are the ways? I'll direct it back to the editor of the magazine, who maybe you're on a daily basis speaking more. What are the ways that we really are more like Cascadia than we are like the United States or Canada, in your observation?
That's a great question. And I go up to Vancouver quite a bit to meet with folks, meet with writers, and keep getting a sense of what's going on there. And I'm hearing increasingly that, particularly on politics, I think we're, Vancouver is really tired of looking to Ottawa on a lot of politics, whether it's the pipeline or a lot of other issues. They feel, and then culturally kind of ignored. Like one of the things I do pretty frequently is I'm always daily trying to find writing by writers in the region, and so looking at local websites, but also stuff national websites. And so I'm going to like the New Yorker or other national publications, and ones in Canada like the Walrus, and it's so and so's from New York, so and so's from Brooklyn, so and so's from L.A., so and so's from Brooklyn, so and so's from and then there's like one from Seattle or one from Vancouver, and so I think there's a sense that we're a bit separate, and just kind of ignored a little bit, and we have a lot in common here, and I think we should be looking, to the city that's, just 3 hours to the south or to the north, and working together. How is that culture, similar?
Well, I'll
Yeah.
add something.
Yeah.
I'd love for anybody to chew on this.
Yeah.
I don't think we feel ignored with quite the same, I'll choose my words carefully here,
Yeah.
but maybe petulance that some of the other regions of the North American continent do. I think we just kind of go, okay, fuck them.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of have a very independent spirit, and we celebrate this region. We celebrate that divorce from the capital, right? In a way that I think is very, it may not be unique, but it's distinct in this region. I don't know, do you have a thought about?
It is very unique, and actually it's part of the best part about being here is that we're not like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Toronto, and it's so tied to being ignored. And yes, we are ignored, especially like I don't think that literarily there's a more ignored literary city than Seattle. Portland, people pay attention to Portland. People pay attention to Vancouver. But especially like in terms of the big cities here, no. Seattle, for some reason, has like sort of still remained off the books. And one of the things I love about being here and have loved since the day I came here in 2005 is the wildness that's here. And if there's something I could say that sort of culturally knits us together in this region, there's a sense of wildness, not just aesthetically, but politically, socially, and artistically. And part of it is from being ignored for so long. It's like we're tucked up in the corner, we're on the frontier, right on the ocean, where nobody really looks at us. Like Montana had a huge fire like two years ago, and no one talked about it. It was enormous, and everyone's like, "Oh, this is happening in Montana," and people are like, "Montana, like, we got this, we're fine,"
Yeah.
And so there's a resilience here, and there's an absolute wildness that has not been tamed yet. And the only other place I really have experienced that kind of wildness in a much more negative way is where I'm originally from in New Mexico, which is total cowboy, crazy caballero country, but this is a very different kind of thing about it, and it is very attached to the land and having so much wild land there. Being near something like the North Cascades, or the Cascades in general, is phenomenal because they're so unmapped. The Olympics are gorgeous, but they are so mapped. There's trails everywhere. They're mapped. They're written about. Like, for decades they've been written about. There's dozens of books and maps you can put in the Cascades. You can't. You have to orienteer. You have to go on trail. If you want to bag a peak, you got to get your butt up there. You got to find your way, and that's wild,
You just dropped some Trailmaster
This is something
I'm taking you out this weekend.
But that's real, it's attached to the land, it's attached to that sort of that conservative wild spirit you find on the east side of the mountains in Montana, in Idaho, in eastern Washington. It's on the peninsula, like crazy people on the peninsula being like, we're going to do this weekend this way, we're going to go hunting, we're going to go fishing, we're going to try this new artistic form, we're going to push this kind of policy because we're in this region, like this is our, and I feel like that's true of Northern California, that's true of most of Oregon, that's true of Washington, most of Montana, like all of these regions, and Canada and Alaska. We get a bit of Alaska and a tiny corner of Wyoming in our bioregion, and that spirit of wildness and a kind of freedom to do whatever. It's more than, at this point, it's gone beyond this sort of just DIY aesthetic and just become like a thing about being here, It's like, even when you look at, like, people talk about their dating profiles, everyone's got to go hiking.
Yeah.
Even if you don't go hiking, you have to put it, that's because that's the spirit of the place.
You gotta have your outdoors pictures.
Yeah, totally. Even if you like faked it at the park.
Yeah.
I mean, this huge like Douglas fir at the park. You know?
I never lied about hiking, but I did add 2 inches to my height, so probably the same type of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so DIY, that's a great way to think about what your guys are trying to do. Now, it wouldn't be actually DIY. There'd be very massive community involvement, but it's not like the federal government is really necessarily stepping in right now,
Right.
and we're trying to connect this region, kind of ourselves, right?
Totally.
How what I want to ask you is, how do you organize a community that when you know that no one out on the outside is even going to help you do it, when you have to do it from the inside?
I guess it comes back to who we are as Cascadians, who we are regardless if you are from British Columbia or if you're from Washington State or Oregon, is that we're all people who came here for opportunity and have that get it done, roll up your sleeves attitude. It's been that way historically from when people came over for the gold rush to when Boeing happened, to when our music scene exploded, to the tech boom. That's part of the story. So the folks here have the gumption to do that, and it's looking beyond the normal ways of how do we get this project built. So it's learning from what people have done that's been successful and not successful. So looking at Taiwan and their high-speed rail system currently. France is another big one. I went over to Berlin to learn about the German rail system last fall, and just seeing what is working there, what are we taking away from folks. And one of the learnings that our organization gathered that we hadn't initially thought about, we're thinking, yes, we want high-speed rail stations in the downtowns, connect them to our transit hubs. But one of the folks in Germany said, well, what about the airports? And I was like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And they said, yeah, we use them to supplement regional air travel here. So it helps when you're low on real estate, such as like at SeaTac or at YVR. High-speed rail would help take some of those regional passengers and move them through the corridor and open up those gates for the airlines to have bigger aircrafts, international flights come in. And so it's looking at things like that. Okay, that's a good business angle for, like a code share for an airline to participate in it. But also looking at private financing as well. So Texas Central, which is another high-speed rail project that's currently underway, they're a little bit further. They're almost right.
Yeah, they're almost
there,
underway.
almost underway. So they're expected to start construction within the next year or so. But they're looking at private financing, so all business interests basically paying for this. And then we also look at what happened with California Rail recently, which was all government funded, and what happened there. There's a lot of touchiness there, but when you have a government funded project over a large part of the state, you're going to run into delays which you may not be able to meet and need more time just because you don't know what you're digging through, or you have legal issues, or it's so much as every small town wants a high-speed rail stop and then it's no longer high-speed rail, and having to navigate those conversations. So we look at, all right, what other countries that have these systems are using private business models. Japan is a big one, and how are they successful and what are they doing? And so the Texas example, they're working with the manufacturers of the Shinkansen and basically learning from this Japan model. And so we're not there yet. We're still in our planning phases, and we'll have more about alignment and station stops and things like that in June when the next WashDOT study comes out. But that's something that we could be open to exploring, is how can we get businesses on board to explore this more, what are the needs of the communities along the way, and the needs of the airports as well. How could we help support a better business model and a better sustainable model for our long-term planning.
Tarika, did you have
I just want to say, I think that's really kind of so interesting and compelling, because that attitude that somebody started the question for you is that the roll up your sleeves, kind of do it yourself thing. Because parts of the region are so progressive.
She's doing finger quotes.
Yeah, I did. They self-profess progressive with finger quotes. there's a kind of resistance to a neoliberal model, which in a way, combining business with a kind of like that kind of incentive, to me is just fucking smart in America. And it's the kind of thing that when you're talking about speaking to like large populations that might be very politically or socially different or use different forms of language, that's just smart to have a business incentive. But to sort of sell it to the cities that are self-professed progressive and like really skeptical of this kind of neoliberal thing, which they see as like when business steps in, that skepticism is such a tension here right now. And to see for the progressive contingent to see something like the California Rail fail, and really that was a ridiculous project. They ran that in so many ways. It was not done well, and it was dropped, and in the weirdest and most unfortunate ways. But to see that as something that's failed and rejected and have that as a talking point from these different areas creates a particular kind of tension in the state to be able to sort of do that. So I'm kind of fascinated with the like kind of business models that you're talking about, and talking about what kinds of businesses you can bring into the bioregion, because it is so essential to how it's been built and how we've like thrived as a bioregion and brought in all these other things. And it's been useful to the arts as well, as much as people don't like to admit it. Yeah.
But it is with learnings from the issues that California had. One of the biggest problems that they ran into was community outreach, which is the basic. You got to tell people what's going on, and you got to get people on board. Air quotes on board,
right, on board.
with the project. Otherwise, people are going to feel left out. If their small town isn't on, you got to stop. You got to be able to bring those people on board and understand why, how this is going to help you, but why it can't be at your back door, and all those questions in between. And one of the great things I think that WashDOT and what our region is doing so well in the planning for this is that they've already caught on to that. So it's like, all right, our next steps are going to be, we're going to focus on this early and make sure that it's done well and that people understand the why and the where, and just be very upfront and clear about that. And then also looking around corners too, with business funding and things like that, is we don't need to wait for the federal government to step up, nor should we,
Yes.
and roll up our sleeves and get it done.
It's so you business, right? Thorny, either side, pros and cons. You got it. Played a major role in, and I don't mean to harp on it because it's not just the carbon tax. It's all the stuff, but that's the one that I think a lot of folks outside the region will look to, right? And they played the certain business interests played such a major role in pushing that this way. But there was this kind of new hope where you did see some business interests actually pushing in quite the opposite direction. How do you think, Tarika, that we can leverage that to do what we're talking about doing with rail, and to talk about what we're maybe doing to perpetuate the arts, right? How do we take that wealth and that influence and actually use it to make this a more livable and more sustainable place?
Well, I think before the panel we were briefly talking about social media, and perhaps the evils of the downsides of social media. But I think one of the things, the positive things about the moment where we are, is that public image is very important to companies, and the public gets to have such an impact on that by using these platforms. Every company wants to be seen as having a green image. Every company wants to be seen as being great on diversity. And I think that you can leverage that in order to push them to actually be those things that they want to be seen as. And that's
ridiculous.
And you have some movements and some organizations trying to do that, organizations that may give companies scores on this and scores on that, and ranking them, and those companies try to move up in those rankings and in those scores. And I think that we're not really doing enough to leverage their desire to be seen in those positive ways and to have that positive image and to be talked about positively on social media. It's incredibly important to companies in the time that we're living in. I think there's a lot of different ways in which we could push them on environmental issues, on diversity issues, to actually be delivering.
One community that has done kind of exceptional with that is the queer community at Pride. it's like kind of gross to talk about it, but like just getting that, like every business now wants to be at Pride, and now Pride is like, if you're gay, it's like one of the most boring things you could go to. Because it's the most corporate parade ever. You're like, why is Alaska Airlines? Where are the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence?
Yeah.
But it's a really similar, like the leveraging. It was barely even leveraging. It's like, listen, Budweiser, do you want to make like millions of dollars during June, or do you not want to make millions of dollars? And I'm like, well, yeah, we do.
We like millions of dollars.
Yeah,
so
I guess that outweighs our family values prospect because they're not buying beer.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
but it's kind of an interesting. I mean, it's just the model. When you're saying that, I'm like, oh God, that's like what the queer community did to like corporations. Like, listen, T-Mobile, you want to be, you want a good score on your diversity quotient? Like, here we're going to represent like people with disabilities and queer people in the streets right now. Yeah.
I think corporations have gotten very good at using language that looks as if they're delivering. But I think that we've also gotten very good at looking through that language and understanding what is actually measuring up and what is not measuring up. And I think we could just do a little bit more to hold people responsible in ways that push the needle forward for things that we're trying to achieve.
That's fantastic.
So we were talking earlier too about with engagements and how when companies are able to figure out, all right, so this is the sweet spot where it's going to resonate with people, they're going to retweet it, etc. But that only has a shelf life to it, and then it's on to the next thing. And you mentioned that we're already catching on to like all of the companies are doing this. Everyone's at Pride. Like, where do you think the tipping point is, and what do you see companies doing next?
You know, no one has asked me a question yet, so.
What do you think?
You know, honestly, I think that there is a way. It's actually very like Barack Obama, like very like 25-year-old Barack Obama, you know, which is like go like kind of tell the big factory that you're coming for them, or they can sit at the table and maybe, you know, they'll get 20% of what they want, right? I think there's a version of that where we kind of maybe it's neoliberal, I don't know, but like where it's like where do the two interests align? We're going to set everything else aside and find and go like dig a tunnel to where those two interests align. And I think you find with rail, with the environment, with the arts, you actually see corporate interests in very narrow ways aligning with each of those three things. Not a mining company doesn't know everything about it, but you know, most other companies really would. They're not interested in sick workers or what have you. So I think that may be the unlock there. Is much more longer term is finding where each company's financial interests are.
Yeah, I mean, like Amazon, you know, they've got a literary fund, and they fund all sorts of projects all around, you know, not just in the region, but you know, nationally and through the world. It would be nice if they like took a little more of their, you know, rocket ship money and like put it into local arts and that sort of thing.
Yeah, they're kind of weird about local arts. It's like they fund national and international arts more than they fund the actual city, not just the bioregion, but it's a little bit of a weird. Amazon's weird like that.
Amazon's weird like a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Well, hey, so one of our guests recently on the show, just a one-on-one, he said something interesting. He said, when you're trying to build something, you want to build the next big thing, where people are not necessarily trying to tear some other thing down, but they're trying to build up the thing that you're building. And people are even drafting in each other's efforts, and you know, great cultures that reach their, now I'm using air quotes, but the zenith of that time for them. You know, the architects and the politicians and the poets and the, you know, the Greco-Roman wrestlers were all kind of drafting toward the same thing. So I'd love to just kind of go round robin and hear what you think that big thing is for this part of the world. Andrew, why don't we start with you?
That's a big one. Next big thing. Does anyone else want to go first?
I mean, I honestly think that the next big thing, environmentally for the Pacific Northwest, would be being a leader on renewable energy, because we're at a point where we know we have to stop using fossil fuels, but we're also at this major point where the fossil fuel industry is pushing natural gas as this false renewable green solution. And I think that we look at ourselves as environmental leaders. We look at ourselves as always being ahead of the curve. And this is an area where we really need to actually get ahead of the curve with investing in actual solutions, trying to build up renewable, utility scale renewables. And I think that, like you were saying, if you get Washington, then other places will follow. I think a lot of places look to us for leadership on that. And so I would say I would love to see that type of investment being made in the Pacific Northwest or in Cascadia in actual green renewable solutions, and being the first people to not just spend our energy on why fossil fuels are bad, but developing, investing money into innovations for green solutions. I would love to see us be more of a leader on that.
Okay. What do you got?
I mean, I think I absolutely agree with that. I'm, of course, going to say that the arts are super important, and because the country, I mean, we're already seen as progressive, we're already seen as these sort of modes of on the precipice of potentially making something happen, whether for it's renewable energy or the light rail or something else entirely. But the thing is we really actually need the arts to tell these stories, to like put them out there. So I actually really think that having the arts boom, making a scene, like solidifying a voice, like something about the culture, is so significant to putting all these other things in place, because people respond to that. They, people want to respond emotionally. They want to have sympathetic and empathetic connections. They want to see similarities, and things like the arts, but in particular, I think storytelling is really important for that. Not just like I'm going to write a story, but also like film and television and things like that are really important to saying that. So like no one's going to really know about the light rail and these amazing potentials if you don't tell the story, which is part of why you need people to do outreach for it, right? To like share that idea, and like this idea of like we need to be this leader in renewable energy, but in a more advanced way, not these like old school 1996 ways, right? Like we're on the verge of doing that, but if we don't get people to tell those stories in compelling ways, even through journalism, creative nonfiction, or a commercial, or someone writes a song.
Even in the arts, one of the most important Latino film festivals in the world occurs every fall in Seattle.
Oh wow!
It's organized by a Cuban expat who gets people who also lived in the artistic community in Mexico City, and it's just, I mean, it's 40 films from all around the world. People fly in here, but Seattleites don't know.
Yeah, that's
right?
interesting.
And so there's this like, we're missing an opportunity to tell the stories that are already happening and making.
The fact that my organization doesn't even know that, and half of the board is Latino, is kind of tragic.
Right. Well, we'll talk after.
We would be like promoting the crap out of that. Yeah.
So my new idea is a museum, an arts museum, powered entirely by renewable energy, that hosts this film festival every year. That's my big idea.
And how do you get there? High speed rail.
Exactly. Everyone comes in.
So, Paige,
50,000 people.
Paige, I have a feeling I know what you're going to say.
It's going to come to a shock.
Yeah.
Yeah. High speed rail. But both of these ideas, I think, are very important to getting people on board with high speed rail too, because we were talking about potentially funding through business versus government, and what that does is if you have a government project, it's very regulated, and there's all these steps that you have to go through, and so your outreach meetings tend to happen like at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, and they're kind of dull and don't really communicate everything that you need to learn. Like the average person wants to learn. They're not communicated in a conversational way to people. It's more of engineering or urban planning terms that gets delivered. So if businesses are coming in, that brings in more opportunities to say, how can we do storytelling? How can we almost market this to people and really like make people tap into emotion and see like how is this affecting people on their day to day? And so that brings in the creative storytellers. That can bring in like musicians. I'd love to see like a music video about high speed rail. That would be cool. I'd be on board with that. But also for the sustainability aspect too, and that's one of the reasons why we're so excited for this to be coming here. And we're talking about the airports. the high-speed rail vehicles are electric, and so they are producing 1/12 of the emissions of an airliner, and so it's just a huge life-changing vehicle in our sense. Yeah. There's the marketing. There's a story. Life-changing vehicle. So there was a study that was done looking in Europe, and if people, I believe it was, if 25% of regional airline passengers in Europe used high-speed rail for their journeys instead of using an airline, and this is, both systems already exist, then it would offset carbon emissions about 25% by 2022. So just like a huge push, just from a small fraction of people being able to change that mode. Here in Seattle, we're running roughly 1,100 flights a week between Seattle, Vancouver, and Portland.
That's a lot. Wow.
That's a lot. That's a ton. Yeah, and
kind of ridiculous amount. Yeah.
It's a lot. And so some fun facts about that. We've learned that the landing pattern. You're already in the pattern to land in Vancouver before you're even taking off from Seattle. It's that close, and you burn the most fuel during takeoff. So when you're running a lot of short hop flights, you're wasting a lot of fuel. So, for example, it's about 2.7 times more efficient to run a flight from Montreal to Miami than it is to fly from Seattle to Vancouver, just because of that, of what's burnt. And things like that we just started researching and thinking about, and some of this came up with the Green New Deal talks that came up recently. And so we're just finding these things like, this is something that could really change the way that people do regional travel, and help the environment and help provide those sustainable solutions. The studies say that for trips within 600 miles or less, so within that window, they are time competitive and cost competitive on high-speed rail as to air travel. So if you look at that, not only in Washington, Oregon, British Columbia, how could we make that model scale to the whole country? And there's organizations like Virgin is looking at the Virgin trains, is looking at that in some other cities currently, from Kansas City to Chicago, and then also from Atlanta to Charlotte.
So you're saying the next big thing is high-speed rail?
It is. Yes.
Where do I sign?
Long-winded, right? You got some fun facts there, but yes. So high-speed rail.
Well, I like thinking about that though, because one of the things that would help the solidification of any identity for Cascadia would literally be a high-speed rail to get people around, to be able to just fly down to Portland really quickly without traffic and without getting on a plane and getting searched, which I always do. That would, that's huge in terms of connecting people and
absolutely.
Yeah.
All right,
And I think so. I've come up with my idea.
I've
had my time to think, and I think it connects to all the things you've said. And that's my idea. Is really, it's sort of a more a thought process thing. Is like getting more people to think about themselves as being from Cascadia. I think is a really great project, and that's why I started the magazine I'm doing. Is like I really, it's so important to cross those borders, and on many different levels. And connecting by in transportation, connecting on environmental issues, cooperating. There's the Cascadia Innovation Corridor now, which is this big organization. It's pretty high level stuff, and it's getting together, the leaders of British Columbia and Washington and Oregon, and that's great. I mean, it's like that border is a big stumbling block on so many of these issues, and we could be doing so much more if that border wasn't there. And I'm not saying, I'm not advocating for, creating your own country sort of thing, but I think, definitely I think there's so much more that we can do together on so many of these different issues. And it's really encouraging to see that, the governors of those and the premiers of those provinces are coming together. And then, just creating that sense where people actually think of themselves as being Cascadian can help that and promote that and feel this sense of identity, feel this sense of home here. Because I think, particularly as the region is changing so much and new people are coming in and people are fleeing, it's like that's always changing, but feeling that sense of home, I think, it's important.
It's like Dixie, but without the baggage.
Well, there's a little baggage.
There's a lot of baggage.
No, fair enough.
Yeah.
All right, so rapid fire. We do this every episode. If you care about, you should. Fill in the blanks.
I can't start with me.
Okay. No one ever wants to start.
I've got a really silly one.
Okay.
If you care about the Cascadia bioregion and these issues, you can sign up for the Cascadia Daily newsletter back in there, and and no, really, I mean, take a look at our site, because I think it's Cascadia Magazine. It's a way to really feel a little bit more connected to this region and learn about the stuff that you don't know about. I've learned so much about British Columbia now that I didn't know before I started here.
If you care about high-speed rail and you want to roll your sleeves up, help us out with some outreach, or even just like follow along on the latest updates, you can reach out to us at Cascadia Rail on both Twitter and Facebook, and we are at cascadiarail.org online.
Fantastic. Tarika, if you care about, you should.
I would say if you care about small businesses, you should support your local bookstore.
Oh.
Yeah.
Give it up for Brendan and Horizon Books, by the way. All right, grand finale.
If you, if you care about living here, just go for a walk and enjoy where you're at while you have it.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for serving on this panel and speaking to the crowd here and being part of creating the exact same culture that we're talking about creating. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. And I'll be able to edit out all the I don't know. I can cut that out. So
Yeah.
You'll seem like geniuses.
Thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Thank you for coming.
All right, great. Hey, can we take a group selfie so I can post it on there?
Gotta get in closer.
Did you want to take some questions?
Oh, questions. Oh, okay.
We've got time for
I don't know if
that.
anybody has any, but I
We
know
will
that
be
was
able to
part of
put
the
them.
advertisement.
Yes.
Yeah.
So someone may have
Yeah.
come with a question.
I think someone is legit.
This is right.
If there's no questions, I'm not trying to hold you here and you have somewhere to go. Please feel free. But if there are any questions, be happy to take them.
It's more of a comment than a question. Andrew, I'm here as a great friend of Dave McCloskey, who is a father of Cascadia and just came out of the poetry conference this weekend, and I'm going to hand out something here that's really more of a helping direct the thought process that we all have around what Cascadia is. And he'd like us to think more about from the place up first. So first of all, see not the issues come down and how we can land them in this place, but what is the spirit of this place? What are the weavings here? What does the place tell us? And I liked, Nadine, what you had said at the very end. If you care about this place, take a walk in it. And so how do we get that spirit? And I took a workshop with Tim McNulty this weekend, a poet. Stuff's probably over here in the shelves. A famous Cascadian poet, and so we went out for a 2-hour walk in an old growth woods, and with these monster trees, and he said, so get your notebook out, just walk with your notebook in hand, and start getting images, and then at the end of the day we sat in an old growth stand and sat down and talked about it, and he said, so I want you to do 3 things with your image. One is really carve out that image, look at it. Second, put yourself in the nature. What does that tell you? I worked on, it was Mother's Day, so I worked with Nurse Log, and the trees suckling from the fallen fir, and as a Mother's Day image. And then what does that tell us? Then you take it universal. What does that tell you how to act? Well, you act as a tender, you act as a mother, you act as someone who cares for the place. And so So it's interesting to look at the poetry first, not from what our ideas are that we come to the place and drop them in here, but from what does the place tell us, and how does that inform our actions. And so I'd like everybody on the panel and those in the room to read what I printed a bunch of copies of. Dave wrote something really, really good for this particular evening, and on how we might be informed in that way, and how we might want to steer away. He's saying, don't look at the politics first. Don't look at all of the issues first. Look at the place, then come back and say, what can we do more for this place to make it more of what it is? So anyhow.
He's also gone all cranky old man on us and just been like, well, I don't know what it is. It's up to you poets to figure it out and find it out. As someone who's worked with him like a few times it's like, I totally know what you're saying about, but it's just kind of funny,
Can I leap in? I think one of the things that's really interesting is one of the we do a whole mix of stuff. We do politics, we do arts, we do poetry, fiction, and the post that we put up that was the most popular post that we've ever put up was Paul Nelson's poem about Tahlequah, the orca, and her calf.
Yes.
And I think that was, again, it's starting from this place. It's starting from these magnificent creatures that live here. And it's like we're seeing this and we're feeling this grief, this amazing grief. And as creatures on the planet, we're like reacting to it. And it stirred up so much in people. And I think in that poem also really drew attention to the crisis that we're facing globally about these things. And so I think that's a good example. I think that that was a lesson to me. It said, okay, yeah, here's this thing people are really emotionally reacting to. And it's because of this place, it's the Salish Sea and all the creatures that are in it. And
that was a fine poem, and thank you for that issue too. And highlighting that was it was really good. And that is exactly the kind of thing. It's like, okay, we're looking at our place. We all go out into the Salish Sea here and sail the waters, and then what are we noticing? And oh my God, if this is the case, and we have to mourn that, and it's that emotional connection that we need to feel first.
So I'm just like really, like I totally get this, and we're talking about natural place and stuff like that. It's just like we also have to remember that there's a lot of people that live in this bioregion, and they're in cities, and they stay in cities, and they like being there. And so another way for me to think about how do we get that into people's minds, into their hearts and stuff like that, is not just about necessarily going for a walk in the woods and being like, oh, look at this tree, it's 'cause in a way there's a little bit of reductiveness for it to become like naturey, or like in poetry we just say like, now we're reducing it to just being nature poetry, and are we really doing anything but writing about a tree or a walk in the forest or this rock I tripped on? It's like, and that's great, that's important and that's great, but like what else? Like how do we get to all these other things and knit them together? And it's not even just that we're in a place, it's like we consume things from that place. And when we're in cities, we don't always think about that. It's like, I'm stoked about sockeye season. When that sockeye run comes in, I'm going to be down at the wharf being like, I want this whole sockeye. I'm going to shove it full of wild blueberries, huckleberries, tied up with some mint, and roast it on a grill. And that's a way in which I consume the things that come from this land, but I don't necessarily have to go for a walk in the woods. And so for people who are urbanites, which is a huge chunk of people, that's another way to think about, well, what do we get from our environment into our urban areas that we don't get anywhere else? Like, what are the unique things that we consume as people in cities as well that can potentially at least connect us to the place? That seems like really important, especially if we're talking about things like the high-speed rail and the carbon tax, which are primarily wanting to connect cities where the density is, so yeah, I don't know, not everybody has the opportunity.
Yeah, I would challenge us as we eat the salmon, and I do too, and I was a commercial fisherman for many years, and I would challenge us to look at the ghost voices. So when we do live in the city, what are the ghosts that are speaking here? And so one of the things that McCloskey and I did when we were looking at the Seattle Commons was look at the ghost creeks that we've buried underground here, that we've stuffed into into combined sewer overflows, and And how do we resurrect those creeks? How do we bring those voices back out? And with the salmon in particular, I think that when we eat the salmon, it's almost a sacrament of this place that we get to share. Yes, it might be a commodity elsewhere, but here it should bring us back to that ghost voice that is the fundamental element of our economy, that is the giveaway. And so the salmon is that which should inform us all that the reason this place exists is because the salmon gives it all away. Every year, it gives away a big chunk of its run.
Or how about the renaming of the peaks? The mountains get renamed to their indigenous names. Is another way that people sort of access that from urban areas, or
Right
the
on.
renaming of the creeks, or the renaming of the streets, or the renaming of a park, or whatever. Like
Or
all
the
of those
Salish
things
Sea.
really matter. Yeah, exactly. Like instead of calling it the Puget Sound or the Sound, to call it the Salish Sea is significant. And most of our SPLAB events, every one that we do, actually, we try to remember what unceded territory we're on. We didn't do that this time, but we're on unceded territory from the Duwamish.
We did.
So,
We did.
oh, did we?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, and that's significant. And part of the reason we do that is both to honor the place and also to remind us of these ghostly things, the
Right
things
on.
that haunt us, the things that haunt the city. That stuff's real. So.
One of the things that we made with intention was when we created our high-speed rail vision map, we didn't make it have state boundaries, so it all looks in one region, and we used icons to show the different mountains without labels. We just have the mountain ranges, we have forests, we have symbols for where wine country is, and then we also labeled the cities and the routing in there as well. So if you haven't seen it, there's copies on the back desk there. But we wanted to make people look at our region as one connected area versus here is an international border or here is a state boundary. And also look at it as going eastward as well, as how are different routes east, how could those be constructed, and where could those go through in different neighborhoods.
In the back?
I was wondering if we could get a quick summary from each of you on a moment when you first started to identify as Cascadian, like where you really started to adopt that moniker or realize that that was a part of how you identified and who you were.
I could start. I mean, there was a moment where I talk about this all the time, actually. There were a moment where I was really identifying with the region and felt sort of bewildered. I was hiking. I'm a pretty big hiker as well, and I was hiking the North Cascades to the top of Desolation Peak, which is very north of the North Cascades. It's where Jack Kerouac spent his time sort of going half crazy in a fire lookout. And you can get to the top of it, and it's got the old, the big map, the circular map, and the lookouts would look all around. You got a 360-degree view of all these amazing mountains all over the place, and looking up into Canada, and just incredible stuff. And then I'm looking at this map, and it's a circular map, right? And you're supposed to spot stuff and see where the fires are going and plot it on there. And there's the 49th parallel, the Canadian border, and everything north on that map was blank, completely blank. And I was just like, this is like, why? Why wouldn't you start thinking about the region as a whole? Why would you ignore the fire, burning just to the north, 2 miles north? So that for me is like one moment was like, this is crazy. You need to think more about what's going on north.
So I'm a transplant, so my story is a little different. I'm originally from Ohio, and I think when I knew that this was home was one of the reasons that drew me 2,000 miles away from my hometown. I came to Seattle for the first time to visit a friend who had moved from my neighborhood out here for a job. And he showed me around, he showed me the city, he took me out to the mountains. We boated across the sound on the ferry, and just seeing a little bit of everything that goes into what makes this place great, meeting people here and how welcoming and open everyone was compared to the Midwest, both with the queer community, but also I feel like as a woman, people advocated for me more in business here as well, and so I saw a lot of strengths there that were missing from back home, and that first visit, I would say I thought about a lot where I was going to move next. Was I going to leave home and come here, or was it going to be somewhere else? And my heart just felt full when I fell out of Seattle, and so I did what I needed to do and made a move out here within 6 months of that, and that's kind of how I knew this was my next place.
I mean, mine is very simple and personal. It's just that when my wife and I really had to dig deep and figure out what we wanted our home to be, and it was actually one of the simplest decisions we had ever made. We just knew that we wanted to do it.
I'd say for me it was about 3 years after I moved here, which was last year. I travel for work quite a bit, giving talks about fossil fuel infrastructure, and I was in Pittsburgh at a conference, and flying back into Seattle as we were beginning our descent, and the pilot was noting that you could look out the window and see the mountains, and that it was a nice view, and I opened the window, and it was just beautiful view, and the sky was pinkish purplish, and it was just one of the most beautiful sights I had ever seen. And I noticed that was the I felt, oh, I'm coming home, whereas before, a city like Pittsburgh, which is more similar to where I am from, would have felt like leaving home and coming back here. So I remember the feeling for the first time and looking out over the mountains that I was coming home. Yeah.
There's that feeling of when you finally hit that, you're like, oh, I'm coming home on a flight is pretty significant. I feel like my story of coming to really realize myself as a Cascadian is a lot longer journey than you guys, so I've been here for 12 years, and I was pretty reluctant to be here and to stay here. I was hell-bent on going back to California as soon as I graduated from my PhD program. And then I think I just almost died in the mountains, and I loved it. I just love that. If I can just go somewhere on a trail run or a mountain bike ride, and I feel like I might die, it's something that just I'm like, yes, that's exciting. Oh my God, I'm gonna climb that mountain. I might die. And I've already scheduled, planned several trips like that this summer. I was like, that's a mountain I could die on. That's on, And then I just got addicted, and I couldn't leave. When I had the opportunity to leave, I couldn't leave. I was like, but I want to die in that mountain. Would I rather die in the city, or do I want to die? So I was kind of and I'm a little bit of a thrill seeker. I definitely tend to push the boundary a little bit. So I think that's probably maybe 5 years ago that really started hitting home for me, where I just felt kind of addicted to the air and the region, and seeing the mountains when I would fly back from California, and going to the mountains and the natural spaces I used to spend time in California, and being like, why does this feel so small? Why are there so many people here? Why does this trail have a name and a directional arrow? So yeah.
Yeah.
I think there was a
We have
question
another
right
question.
here.
Oh, I was just going to bring up one thing everyone should tap into is David McCloskey's Cascadia map. It's an
It's
artwork
beautiful.
in itself, and it really does gives you so much detail. It's spectacular. And
We have a copy up on the wall if you would like to look
Does
at
it have is it the one with that goes out to the
Yeah, and it
plate
brings
shelf?
the Cascadia
Oh, God.
Subduction Zone.
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
And
and then
Yeah.
what Andy brought up about Mount, what's the mountain you were on?
Desolation.
Desolation
Oh,
Peak.
yeah.
So there's a book called Poets on the Peaks.
Mhm.
That is really highly recommended, about all the poets that spent time, Gary Snyder and all the up on those lookouts, and it's a great historical reference and story. So
They used to have a class too, but I think they stopped teaching it at the North Cascades Institute. They used to have a class that they ran once a year, Poets on the Peaks, and you'd go on a hike or something. I don't know, but I haven't seen it in a while.
yeah, and then just one thing I keep thinking about ever since the Cascadia name has kind of come back over the last 10 years or so, whatever, is now that I have a son in Garfield High School,
why isn't the bioregionalism actually part of our curriculum?
Mm-hmm.
Because I really think if you catch the youth, early enough, they become really informed about all the diversity and the details of this incredible place we live. So, and I've lived here over 40 years. So, but I came from New England originally. But yeah, it's been home, and I wouldn't live anywhere else. So, and my son doesn't really want to leave here either. So yeah.
Done good, Dad.
Yeah, and it hasn't been mean. I haven't tried to condition him. It's just an organic unfolding that's happened, and he sees me, get upset about stuff that's going on, but also celebrate the beauty and incredible natural offerings it has. So.
Yeah, it's a shame because my kids took like Washington State history, and it was the most boring class they'd ever done. So it seems like you could replace that with some sort of a more regional, bi-regional sort of something that roots you in the region.
Yeah.
Because it shouldn't be boring.
Yeah, my son reflected about some of his history about the Northwest very enthusiastically. So I'm sure it depends on the teacher and the phase they're in. But I just think and that's not just for the kids. I think there's so many people moving in from so many different territories in our country and other places that I'm amazed. Like if I point to a mountain, like you're talking about going to the Cascades, I spend a lot of time in the mountains as well, and I point to that volcano that's to the east of us, and I say, and most people can't name it, whether it's the English name or the native name, and it's the only wilderness volcano left, Glacier Peak, right? And that's my favorite place. Glacier Peak Wilderness is just astounding.
I
almost died, and then but when I was up near Glacier Peak, I was with someone backpacking, and I kept seeing people go up with skis, and I was in Spider Meadow area, and I was like, oh my god, they have to orienteer across this like shrinking ice field, and just seeing the pictures of the ice fields that used to be there and the actual iceberg and how quickly it disappeared, and then watching people like cross that, I want to die there. Yes.
You don't have to die there. Just
I
go
want to almost die there. Yeah.
But
I don't
no,
really
but
want to die,
like
yeah.
if you look at on the maps and you look at what the Seattle River, the Seattle River drainage, it's a very remote. It takes a lot of effort to get up there and in there. And I spent 4 or 5 days there just in last September. And as I get older, it takes a lot more time and effort. But it's just astounding. It's beautiful.
Have you ever gone fishing back there? Is there any good fishing?
No, I'm not a fisherman, but anyway, it's a special place.
Gary Snyder used to write about that watershed from up on the peaks, actually,
Right.
which I know you probably know about.
Oh, yeah, that's what I love about that book and about his writings.
All right, well, thanks everyone for your questions, and thanks for participating. One more time for the panelists.
Thanks for hanging out with us on our Friday evening. It is Friday.
It is.
Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think
We
it
do.
was 22.
It's for the post on the website.
And I got a small grant.
Funny to share with everybody, if that's okay. We can.
Much you wouldn't mind.
I think we did a painting called Cascadia.
Yeah, maybe some.
Like wide angle.
You guys want me to take it?
You got it? Yes.
No, I mean, I feel like you should.
We got it.
You should do it.
Someone-
Yeah.
No, I- Alright, one more. But I'm so heavily